there's a popular conception, at least in North America, that anarchism is Eurocentric, that the origins of anarchism in Europe have kind of determined the development of anarchism. And one of the ways in which I counter that is by, I point out that there, if you think about anarchism as an anarchic way of organizing society, then arguably there are many ways in which peoples around the world have lived without states, cooperatively, and anarchically. And there have been quite a few anthropologists who have written about this kind of phenomena, recognized this and looked at different cultures and written about the anarchic aspects of those cultures and so on. And some people have argued on a philosophical level and a level that deals with political theory and consciousness, consciousness of our relationship to the environment and our sense of freedom and its importance. You can go back to a philosophy like Taoism, which developed in China, and you can see all sorts of anarchic aspects to it. So when does anarchism begin as a movement? In a sense, anarchism has always been with us. Anarchism begins as a political movement, certainly in Europe, in the context of the rise of capitalism and the nation state and industrialism. And it begins as a critical approach to those forces, recognizing that they are not benefiting the planet or benefiting us as a species. Quite the opposite. So I guess what I'm saying is there's an embeddedness in human experience of anarchism. Anarchism is part of human experience. It's part of the way in which we've organized ourselves and our societies. You can go back before the history of anarchism as such to find anarchic instances of anarchic societies, and we should never forget that. But in terms of anarchism as a movement, yes, begins in Europe, but simultaneously spreads way beyond Europe. In the 19th century, in the early 20th century, we have anarchists in Japan, in India, and elsewhere who are developing anarchist theory and practice in the context of their own cultures and lives and values and so on. And so there's actually a radical diversity to the anarchist movement from the get-go. I think this diversity is in part because anarchists don't ascribe, as Marxists do, to a teleological, a sequential version of historical development which privileges industrialism as the precursor to socialism, and therefore, by implication, Europe is the center from which socialism is going to develop as the mode of production that develops in Europe around industrialism. And capitalism is the engine for encouraging industrialism, spreads around the world. That's a good thing in Marxist theory. And in fact, that is the precursor to socialism, the spread of this kind of dynamic industrialist process of development, economic developments, etc. And that mode of social organizing that facilitates that development, first developed under capitalism, and then the Marxist project is to seize control of the state and reconfigure economic relations around socialist values, etc., and relations of production around socialist values. And industrialism is the foundation of social society. Well, that isn't necessarily the case in anarchist theory, and certainly in the era of colonialism, we have instances of anarchists developing alternative notions of what an anarchist society would look like that aren't at all tied to industrialism. that in fact refuse that, and in the act of refusing that, also refuse a Eurocentric kind of grounding for anarchism. I've written on one of these theorists, and the way in which his work influenced the anarchist movement in Europe and the United States. His name's Ananda Kumaraswamy, not a familiar name in the anarchist movement, but nonetheless for me very important, precisely because he's theorizing an alternative to industrial capitalism. He actually coins a term for it. He calls it post-industrialism, and conceives of a renewal of anarchism in Europe on a non-industrial foundation, which will mirror the reorganization of India and Indian society along anarchist lines. He actually draws on traditions in Buddhism and Hinduism, mixing them with anarchist notions of personal freedom linked with Friedrich Nietzsche and so on, and creates this very, very interesting notion of an anarchist consciousness that he ties to an alternative economic system linked to the arts and crafts. This is very complex stuff, but it's part of the history of the movement, and it certainly steps outside of a Eurocentric focus. It's frustrating to me as a historian of anarchism to encounter quite often people just dismissing anarchism as Eurocentric. That isn't the case.